Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And Christe Nesti. Christ is risen, everybody. Welcome. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. I'm Gary Michuta. Welcome. It's great to see everybody, and Christ is risen indeed. And what better way to start off the Monday after Easter than to dive into defending, explaining, sharing the faith? Because after all, it's the resurrection that is the most substantial proof of Christ claims to be the Messiah and Son of God. And so armed with that fact, and for the next 40 days afterwards, the apostles had a very important apologetic to make for the truth of Christianity. And so we're following humbly in their footsteps. And so welcome to the show, everybody. It's great to be with you. We're going to have a fellow on that I really admire his work. He has an excellent website out there called classicaltheism.com. His name's DeRosa. And he was on back when the dojo went out west to the world headquarters, but we had a lot of phone problems. And so I wanted to bring him back on the show to redo that show because he has such great information. He's so articulate. But because of phone problems, I think we only maybe got about one segment in that was clear, and the rest was hit and miss. And so, God willing, the phone lines will be great, and we're going to have an awesome show talking with John about answering atheist slogans. There's lots of little slogans that are thrown out, little cliches that sometimes trip us up. John's going to help work through some great answers that we can give in response to these little nifty slogans that are thrown around. And also on the show, we're going to have our Finding the Fallacy segment, which is circular reasoning. And also we're going to meet the early church father, who is Saint Cyprian of Carthage. Very important early church father, North African father. And we'll dive into his past, a very interesting past. And as always, you are part of the show. So especially after the break when we get John on the phone, give us a call if you have any questions or comments at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Or you can always send us an email. We love to hear from you. And, not only if you have questions, but also if you maybe are in a situation that you'd like to bounce things off, maybe your fellow co-workers raising objections to Catholicism, or someone babysitting, or maybe you have a loved one who's thinking about leaving the church or has some objections not really sure how to handle. Shoot us an email at questions@handsonapologetics.com. It's questions@handsonapologetics.com. I do see them and I do respond, and occasionally we even carry them over to the show. And, we'd love to hear from you. But there's been some really great questions that have been in the dojo mailbox that we've used for programs. And so please do. Love to hear from you. And by the way, it's time for me to give my shout-outs to those watching live stream on social media on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hey, I see some names I haven't seen in a little while. So, hey, Missionary for Christ, howdy, Navy 76. Welcome aboard, folks, in the, I always call it the social media section of the dojo. And, of course, I want to welcome you listening on radio and also on podcast. We're grateful that you're aboard, and I think you're going to enjoy the program. So, without further ado, there's the emojis. All right, thank you. The forums always have this splash of emojis. Let's jump into the Finding the Fallacy segment of the program. And like I said, today's Finding the Fallacy is the circular reasoning fallacy. What is circular reasoning? Well, you can kind of guess by the name that you're arguing in a circle. In other words, you're assuming things that you want to conclude or prove. For example, you might start off with the idea that the Bible's inspired, and then based on that idea that the Bible's inspired, you prove the inspiration of the Bible. That would be circular reasoning. Or you could start off with like basically any premise and just go around in a circle and end up with that premise. And that's kind of like building a house from the roof down. You can't do it. You got to start at the foundation and work your way up to the roof. And circular reasoning attempts to kind of do it backwards by assuming what you're trying to prove, then using that assumption as proof of what you're going to prove. Hence, you go around and around and around in circles. So that's our finding the fallacy for today's circular reasoning. And by the way, the best way to disarm this particular fallacy is simply to point out the assumed premise. That sometimes can be a little difficult. It can be hidden. Sometimes it can be an unstated premise in the argument. So you're going to have to think it through and flush it out. I know for those who talk, in the middle of a dialogue, it's hard to kind of sift through what exactly are the unstated premises. But, sometimes through God's grace, you're able to spot it and try to shout it out. Say, hey, look, your argument's wrong because you're assuming, this what you're trying to prove at the outset, and work them through it. All right, so let's jump to Cyprian of Carthage, shall we? Saint Cyprian of Carthage died roughly AD 258. He is, of course, the Bishop of Carthage in North Africa. He's also sometimes known as the African Pope. A lot of people don't realize this, but the word Pope or Papa just simply means father. And so bishops in the early church were called Pope because they're papas, they're fathers. So he's known as the Pope of Africa. Okay, so a very important bishop, in other words. He was born in Carthage to wealthy pagan parents, and sometime between the years AD 200 and 210, he converted to Christianity, and about 246 AD, he was raised to the priesthood, and soon after he became Christian. In 248 or 249, he became the Bishop of Carthage. And it's right about then that there was a very fierce persecution that broke out under the Emperor Diocletian, roughly around AD 250, in which Cyprian fled from his city, from his diocese, and hid in the hills outside the city in comparative safety, where he directed his flock through a series of letters. Now, there's no doubt that Cyprian was not running out of cowardice. In fact, it was out of concern for his flock. He figured he could do more good in hiding and directing them rather than offering his life and them not having a leader during this time. And the reason we know this is because ultimately he does accept martyrdom. But so it was well intentioned that he left. The problem is that his conduct in this persecution made him an easy target for barbs of his enemies, especially those who found it necessary to reprove the faction who wanted an immediate and easy reconciliation of the lapse. One of these factions, a priest named Novatus, showed his bad faith when breaking with Cyprian, allegedly because Cyprian was not easy enough on the lapsed. He went to Rome and joined a schism of Novatian, who was extreme rigorous in respect to the reconciliation of the lapse, generally denying reconciliation entirely. And that's one of those things that when this persecution broke out, it's what do you do afterwards? How do you reconcile those people who repudiated the faith? Well, the rigorist that Novatian was behind said they can't come back. And but others were more lenient. We should also note that Cyprian was also in excellent terms with Pope St. Cornelius I, but he fell out sharply with Cornelius' successor, Pope St. Stephen I, on the question of rebaptizing the converted heretics. There had been a custom in the African church to regard baptism of heretics as invalid, and in spite of Pope Stephen's severe warnings, Cyprian never yielded. And he believed that each bishop basically should do what he wants to do and is answerable only to God in that regard. The dispute was a very dangerous stage when the edict of the Emperor Valerian renewed the persecutory measures against Christians and prevented it from ending in disaster. Pope Stephen was martyred in 256 AD. Cyprian was exiled in August of 257 and was beheaded near Carthage. On September 14th, 258 AD, he is the first African bishop to die a martyr's death. So, St. Cyprian, very important early church father, a Latin writer. All his writings are in Latin. And this falling out with the Pope has also been a focus of anti-Catholic attacks on papal primacy and stuff like that. But really, in the next 30 seconds or so, no way I could possibly go through all of that. But just something to keep in mind about our Meet the Early Father for today, St. Cyprian of Carthage. Again, died AD 258. Very important early father. We have lots of writings from him, including a very good treatise he wrote on the unity of the church. That's one of those odd things about Cyprian, is that he is supposedly denies papal authority, and yet if you look closely at his writings, you can see that he very clearly understands the Bishop of Rome, the See of Rome, to be the one seat that unifies the entire church. And therefore, basically, it has a headship. So, all right, we'll park it right there, folks. That's the Meet the Early Church Father for today. Coming up next, John DeRosa at classicaltheism.com is going to join us, and we're going to kind of debunk some of the little zingers, cliches, and jargons used by atheists and new atheists, and come up with some great responses. So you want to stay tuned? This is Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. Be right back.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. You know, there's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. And we're going to talk about defending, explaining the existence of God. And part of that is to deal with, I guess you could say, atheistic slogans, cliches, that type of thing. And we're also going to talk a little bit about different approaches to proving the existence of God. Now, our guest who's going to be coming on is John DeRosa, who has done a lot of work in this area. And he's going to explain to us the different kinds of approaches, because not every argument for the existence of God is the same. There is what's called Classical Theism, which is rooted in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And there's also a kind of a theistic argument called personalism. A personalist approach to theism, and this is championed by a lot of people. I'm not going to name names, but they're very popular. Largely, they're evangelicals, and although in some ways their arguments are very good, it simply doesn't. It's not as strong as the arguments of Thomas Aquinas and those found in Aristotle and the classic approaches. So he's going to help work us through these problems, and in fact, he's online, so that's good. And our guest is John DeRosa, who received an undergraduate degree in math education at the College of New Jersey, an MA in Pure and Applied Biblical Mathematics in Montclair State University. He runs an incredible website, and for those apologists out there listening to me, you got to check it out. It's www.classicaltheism, one word, classicaltheism.com. There's awesome podcasts, there's free books, there's a list of resources to pick up. So if you're interested in defending some of the foundational truths of the church, you want to check that out. And John, welcome to Hands-On Apologetics.
Gary, thanks for having me back. I'm a big fan of this podcast. I love listening, and it's great to be on again.
Well, hey, that makes two of us, because I'm a big fan of your website, so I'm always sending people your way. You have a lot of great interviews and other material on there. When did you start it?
I really appreciate you sending people that way. We officially started the website last summer, but I didn't start the podcast until the fall. The podcast was in the fall, and that's really the best part. As you know, I call ourselves studious amateurs over at the Classical Theism podcast, because I get to bring on experts and learn alongside with the audience, about all these great ideas.
Yeah, and you've had some really great guests. I mean, people like Dr. Edward Fazer has been on your show. You had Carlo Broussard. You also had some people that I'm not familiar with, but they dive into a lot of interesting topics.
No, they're great. And I actually, as a heads up, I'm always looking at your show as more ideas for guests, because you have great people on as well who just help us defend, the three pillars of the Catholic faith. Sometimes we'll have somebody defending God's existence. Sometimes, it's an attribute of classical theism. Other times it's Jesus Christ or even the Catholic Church. So we kind of try to hit those three pillars, and I'm always looking to you for good guests as well.
Well, that's great. I'll rip off your arguments. You can rip off my guest list. It sounds like a good exchange. I was just mentioning before the engineer said that you're ready, that there's a difference out there between just the popular theistic arguments, proofs for the existence of God that we hear a lot with, especially with evangelicals, as opposed to classical theism. What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would actually make a couple distinctions. One, we can talk about the arguments for God in a second, and first, just what is classical theism, and then second, I'll talk about how the arguments are different. But first, what is classical theism? Why not just say theism? And what I would say is, the first thing I want to always start out with, for classical theists, we say that God is the ultimate and necessary foundation of all reality, of all things that exist. And everything we say about God is going to be consistent with that. He's not a person like us, but with more superpowers, like a Superman in the sky or a sky fairy. He's not like that at all. He's radically different from us in his own divine nature. And aspects of classical theism have been held by a wide variety of philosophers. So people like Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. In a pagan context, people like Athanasius, Augustine, and Aquinas in a Christian context, and even philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes in a Muslim context. They're quoted by Aquinas a lot in the Summa. And even the great Rabbi Maimonides in a Jewish context also defends a lot of tenets of classical theism. Now, when you give such a list of thinkers, they're not going to agree on every single aspect, but the traditional core of classical theism, that God is the ultimate necessary foundation of all reality, and that he's radically different from us. He's not just a Superman or a person like us with more powers. All those great thinkers would agree with that core. And you might say, okay, well, doesn't everyone agree with that? Isn't everyone a classical theist? And I'll give you a little bit more information, because I had a great guest on recently, Dr. Eleanor Stump, and she helped me make a distinction, because in the last few centuries, many theists have challenged some of God's traditional attributes. And Dr. Eleanor Stump, if you listen to that podcast episode, she'll tell you more. But basically, she points out that classical theists are willing to accept not just the traditional attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. You'll find a lot of people who will accept those. In all forms of Christianity and even Islam and Judaism, a lot of people will accept omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. They'll attribute that of God. But classical theists go a little bit further. They accept the whole batch of attributes discussed by patristics and medievals, including divine simplicity, divine immutability, and divine eternity. So she pointed to those three as a helpful distinction, because nowadays a lot of people would, accept those first few attributes, but they're not necessarily going to go along with divine simplicity, immutability, and eternity, even though they were held by patristics, medievals, and affirmed by Catholic councils. So, in a nutshell, that's classical theism.
Yeah. Now, what's the opposite approach that's also theistic?
Yeah, so there's a couple words for it. I'm not too up to date on the history, but just I follow Dr. Edward Fazer a lot. But the two words, there was a term coined by Father Brian Davis, who's a Thomist and a classical theist. He refers to theistic personalism, and there's another term coined by Norm Geisler, who's an evangelical apologist, and he also calls it Neo Theism. And if you want, it's hard to paint people with a broad brush, but one thing you might say about this theistic personalism or neo-theism is they model God kind of as a person like we are, not necessarily like we are, but that's the model that they begin with, and then they strip away all of our limitations. So they say, okay, let's say God is like a person, but he's not limited in this way, he's not limited in this way, and he ends up, having some of the traditional attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, and perfect goodness, but they're not going to ascribe to him divine simplicity, immutability, and eternity. They're going to be more skeptical and only really rely on what maybe they can deduce from Scripture or, a particular argument that they favor. Whereas personally, this is one of, I think, the great reasons to be Catholic is, the Church has authoritatively declared that the God of classical theism exists. So yes, you might see some arguments for different attributes here and there. You might say, oh, that kind of sounds convincing, or I don't really understand divine simplicity that much. It sounds, divine simplicity. You think it's simple. It's actually pretty complex and hard to understand. I've done some episodes on it. But thankfully, we have the Church who, in the Fourth Lateran Council and the First Vatican Council, you can find this in Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. He goes through the attributes. He says they're de fide. And we declare, God is like this. And maybe we cannot fully comprehend him, at least in this life, but we can know that he has these attributes and, hope to understand him more in the beatific vision. But yeah, the neo-theists and theistic personalists, they're more willing to deny some of those attributes that I mentioned and also think about God more like us. More anthropomorphically is a word that you'll hear of. Now, not completely. I don't want to straw man their position, but they're more willing to do that, is what I would say.
Yeah, so not all arguments for the existence of God are the same. Because it seems to me like theistic personalism would actually open itself up to some atheist objections that I think it would be very difficult for them to defend. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I forgot to say something about the argument, so I'm glad you brought that up again, because what classical theists rely on, and I think you mentioned this towards the intro, primarily we see St. Thomas Aquinas as our leader, but there's a lot of people who have held, classical metaphysical arguments, and what they do is their arguments are going to be primarily philosophical, they're going to be deductive, and they're going to be based on metaphysics. So briefly, I'll just say what I mean by that. By a philosophical, they're not going to be, we're not going to be talking about arguments with Big Bang cosmology or, the fine-tuning of the universe. Not to say that those are bad arguments. I think they're good. But those are, they have a lot of scientific evidence behind them, whereas we're just going to focus on the philosophical. They're metaphysical because they stem from metaphysical principles of being, or the fundamental building blocks of reality, not just things that we discover in a laboratory, but things that we can grasp, general concepts that we can grasp with our intellect, just as rational beings in the world, and we reason from these principles, and, starting with some observation in the world back to, and this is where I say it's deductive, because we take these general metaphysical principles, and then we reason back to deductively the God of classical theism. So for Aquinas, that's where you get his 5 ways. He talks about reasoning back from the idea of change to an unchanging changer, the idea of causality to the first cause. He reasons back, there's an argument from contingency, you could say, from talking about contingent beings, and then back to a necessary being. He talks about degrees of being, and then he also talks about final causality and the way that things are directed towards certain ends, and then he reasons back to a necessary intelligent reality to direct those things there. So I would say classical theists, in their argumentation, rely on philosophical, metaphysical, and deductive proofs for God. And, the primary example now, pick up a copy. It's incredible. You'll learn so much. I return to it all the time, is Dr. Edward Feser's 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. He'll walk you through these proofs, as well as how the attributes come out of that. And we rely mostly on those arguments, whereas maybe someone who doesn't defend classical theism may rely more on the contemporary arguments. And personally, when we're doing conversations and apologetics, like you've had people on who defend a range of arguments, and I think they're all good. I think some of the arguments of fine-tuning, from the beginning of the universe, the Kalam arguments, some moral arguments, I think they're absolutely very, very good. It's just they may not get us to the same place as the philosophical, metaphysical, deductive demonstrations.
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, hey, we only have a few, about 30 seconds left. So coming up on the other side of the break, I want to talk to you about your free ebook, which, by the way, you can get at classicaltheism.com, everyone. Just go down there and sign up, and you can get this awesome free ebook called Answering Atheist Slogans, How to Respond to 11 Skeptical Slogans in Conversation. We're talking with John DeRosa of classicaltheism.com. Check it out. Maybe you can download it during the break. And when we come back, John, let's hit a couple of the common slogans.
Sounds great.
All right. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics, folks. I'm Gary Machuda. Stay tuned. We're going to talk more about atheist slogans on the other side.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet 3 men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
With John DeRosa of ClassicalTheism.com. And John, you have lots of awesome resources free on your site. I love free, especially free. And one of those resources, I believe you can get by signing up on your mailing list, is an awesome ebook titled Answering Atheist Slogans, How to Respond to 11 Skeptical Slogans in Conversation. I'm so glad that you wrote this, because there are these, new atheism has these zingers that the average person, they give the deer in the headlights look, when they throw out these zingers at them. And you did a great job just taking them and giving practical advice about how to respond. So do you want to try to handle a few of these slogans?
Absolutely. And if I could just say a quick little insight before we go through some of them.
Okay.
I wrote this book. We were talking a lot about, some heady philosophical ideas before the break, but this book is not about that. This book is just, popular level, practical things that I've picked up from Trent Horn, from other apologists, William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, Dr. Edward Fazer, and I just kind of assembled 11 of these slogans, but I keep building it. The first edition was 9 or 10 slogans. Then it's 11. My next edition, I'm still working on it because I go back, I read it. I don't know if you have this, this same thing happens to you, Gary, but I read something, I'm like, I could have wrote this a little bit better, and I want to add to it. So next one I think is going to be 15 atheistic slogans. But if you're on the mailing list, you'll definitely get the latest version of the booklet, and I hope these will help you out. And the main principle that I try to follow, I give a couple, preliminary principles. One, I'll give you three. Sorry, real quick, and then we'll go to the slogans. One, you should pray every day. If you're going to be talking with unbelievers and atheists, you want to pray every day to stay close to the Lord, and especially because that'll help you discern more what a particular person needs at a point in time. Once you become, I listen to these people. I listen to Jeff Cavins and other folks who have real deep spiritual lives. They're able to discern what to say in conversation. So I think daily prayer helps that. Second principle I'll say is you got to have realistic expectations. Apologetics is going to be more effective when people are open to and seeking the faith. If they're just closed, rude, and angry and throwing out these slogans one after another, don't expect that you're going to convert them on the spot. And we need to recognize this. The Holy Spirit has to open their hearts. Pray for them, yet you can give a thoughtful response that will help you be more confident and maybe any other Catholics who are listening. And then the third principle, what I try to follow throughout the book, and Trent Horn makes this really clear if you listen to him on the radio, it's always more effective to ask questions of the person before making statements. Of course, you're going to have to make some statements. You're going to have to respond to what they said. But if you can do it through asking questions, you'll put yourself in the driver's seat of the conversation. You'll find out more about what they believe, and you'll be more able to help them see that the slogan really doesn't have much of an effect.
Yeah, I think that's the most important, is that you force them to think critically about their own position.
Exactly. And that's what I try to do. So for each chapter, for each slogan, I'm going to try to give you at least one, maybe two, or even three questions you can ask when someone uses it.
Very good. Okay, well, why don't we jump into, I'll pick the first one. This is something that you hear often. It's, let's see, there's no evidence for God's existence.
That's right. So, and you'll hear this a lot. There's no evidence for God's existence. They might say it emphatically. They might stomp their feet. They might pound the table. Just calmly ask the following question. Got this one from Trent Horn. Here's what you ask when someone says there's no evidence for God's existence. You say, well, you know what, here, let me ask you something. What's the best evidence you've heard, and what do you think is wrong with it? So you ask that person, what's the best evidence or what's the best argument for God's existence that you've ever heard, and what do you think is wrong with it? And when you ask that question, there's really only 3 types of replies that a person can give. They can just say, oh, I've never heard anything. I've never heard any evidence for God's existence. It's just blind fairy tales. And if that's their response, then you could say, oh my gosh, you've never heard of any reasons to believe in God? Well, have you ever considered the kalam argument for God's existence, the contingency argument, the moral argument? And you have, maybe 2 or 3 that you can list and then offer one of them for their consideration. That's if they say they've absolutely heard none. A second possibility, they might say, well, I've heard some people say that, life couldn't have come about through evolution, so God had to do it. They might offer some weak evidence like that, or they might refer to like Paley's watchmaker argument, which a lot of people think has been undone by evolution. I'm not necessarily saying it has, but they'll say, people say, look at all this complex reality, look at the stars, look at all these, insects and different animals. Therefore, there had to be a God. That's like the best evidence I've heard. And you could say, wow, that's the best evidence you've heard? Personally, I don't really think that's good evidence at all. Have you ever considered X, Y, and Z? And then you can offer 1 or 2 of your stronger arguments. Third possibility, person says, so the first possibility was they said, oh, I've never heard any evidence. Second possibility, they say, oh, I've heard some evidence, but you judge me, like when we're listening, that the evidence was pretty weak that they offered. The third possibility is that they have heard of a strong piece of evidence and they see a problem with the reasoning. So maybe they say something like, well, I've studied the contingency argument, or I've studied the argument from Aquinas, the first mover, and I just don't think it works because of this. And if that's the case, by the way, a person using a slogan like there's no evidence for God's existence, they're probably not going to give that kind of an answer. They're probably not someone who has studied the first mover, the contingency argument, the moral argument, and other things. They're probably going to give more superficial answers. But if they do say that, you should affirm them in their study, and you should compliment them for looking into theistic arguments. You should say, hey, you know what? I appreciate that you took the time, or that you took this argument seriously, and then you try to answer whatever objection they had with it. Maybe they, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So we're answering the slogans generally, but, maybe they object to the first mover argument because, Aquinas relies on outmoded physics in his Summa. And then you have to answer that. Or maybe they object to the contingency argument because they think it commits a fallacy of composition. And then if you've studied the argument, you can answer that. And if they have a really sophisticated objection, again, if they're just throwing out slogans, they probably don't. But if they have a really sophisticated objection, you might even have to say, that's a great point, and I haven't thought about that, but I'm going to look into that and get back to you because I do think the argument is good, and I think your objection can be answered. So that's how I would go about it. If someone tells me there's no evidence for God's existence, I'm asking him a question. I'm saying, well, what's the best evidence you've heard, and what do you think is wrong with it?
Yeah, that's very good. And if maybe philosophy isn't your cup of tea, you could always point them to a resource too. You could say that's a great objection. Let me see if I could get some resources, and give them Ed Fazer's book, or there's lots of other great books too. You could loan them.
That's a great point, especially if it's a short conversation. I've come to realize I actually got that tip from Brandon Vaught, who's another Catholic doing great work. He said, a lot of times in short conversations, you can't get super deep into stuff, but have some good resources that you can recommend. Good point, Gary.
Yeah, I have in my trunk, I have a box full of books and stuff. So it's like, give me a second, let me run to my car. And I just so happen to have a book on that topic. But yeah, very good. Let's do this slogan. I actually, my son experienced this. He was texting, it was in a group text, and he said, gotta go to Mass. And then one of his friends said, oh, I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
Sure. Yeah, no, and that's a common thing, and it can be phrased in different ways. Maybe they said, maybe the slogan could also be like, science has disproved God, or, like I said, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. So what's a good question to ask there? So again, we're following that tactic. Let's ask questions before we make statements. Because if your son, if someone in the conversation, if they just launch into a whole argument, they might spill 2 pages of text, 5 minutes of talking, and then it's not even relevant to what the person is thinking. So by asking questions, you can kind of draw out where they're coming from. The question to ask here is, what precisely is the incompatibility that you see between believing in God and believing in science? And I'll say that again because it's really important. You ask them, what precisely is the incompatibility you see between believing in God and believing in science? And that way they can actually spell out for you what they think. And in the meantime, you should have answers prepared to what I call the 3 most common objections in that realm. So if someone does throw out this slogan, they typically have 3 things in mind, and you can prepare some quick answers to them. But typically they say evolution has disproved God, because there's evolution, we don't need God anymore. Or they'll say miracles. Scientists don't rely on miracles, and they show that miracles are scientifically impossible, something like that. Or scientism. And scientism, which is the view that says, well, all real knowledge comes through the scientific method, but knowledge of God doesn't come through the scientific method, therefore knowledge of God can't be real knowledge. So you ask them that question about incompatibility, I can pretty much predict they're going to come up with one of those 3 things: evolution, miracles, and scientism. Do you want me to just respond to those real quick?
We have 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I can hit those 3 in 2 minutes, and then I can go a little bit more rapid fire on the other side of the break if you just want to hit more of the slogans. But briefly, what you can say to evolution is, hey, as Catholics, it's in our catechism that we can accept evolution. And theistic evolution is something that a lot of priests and other scientists are working on. Father Gregor Mendel was a great geneticist, and he was a Catholic priest, so there's nothing wrong with believing in evolution and also believing in God. With miracles, the key response, it comes back to worldview with this, because if God exists, you can ask the person, hey, wouldn't you agree that if God exists, he could work a miracle? And what are they going to say? No, God can't even work a miracle. Well, then we're not talking about God, because if God exists, God can work a miracle. Right. And then the third thing I would say is scientism, which says that all real knowledge comes through the scientific method. You have to ask them about that statement. And Carlo Broussard is great with this, but you just ask them, hey, does that belief itself, does the belief in scientism come through the scientific method? Does your belief that all knowledge comes through the scientific method come through the scientific method? And it turns out to be self-defeating, because there's no set of experiments that spit out the conclusion that all knowledge comes through the scientific method. You can't mix chemicals in a lab and arrive at that conclusion that, oh, hey, look, it just spelled out, what? All our knowledge comes through the scientific method. So if evolution is compatible with God's existence, if God can work a miracle, and if philosophy, in addition to science, can help us arrive at knowledge, well, then this slogan has no force. There really is no true incompatibility between believing in God and believing in science. And I would just tell the person, as Catholics, we love science.
Very good. Wow, beautifully done. We're talking with John DeRosa on his free ebook, Answering Atheist Slogans, available at classicaltheism.com. We'll be right back, folks.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet 3 men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're talking with a good friend of the show, and like I said, I rip off as much as I possibly can from his website. It's John DeRosa, and the website is classicaltheism.com. And John, I bet you wouldn't mind this, but I would recommend that if you download the book, that you send copies of it to like everybody you know, because this is so useful.
Oh, and honestly, I don't mind that at all. I want the content to get out to people and provide helpful content. So if you download it, yeah, that's a great tip. Send it to 2 or 3 friends that you think could be helped by it. But then if you're on the email list, you'll get the new edition. I'm hoping to amp it up to 15 slogans soon. But until then, I'm going to keep ripping off your guests as well.
All right. Well, hey, let's jump to another slogan. Maybe we could get a couple before the close. And by the way, this is just a small sample of all the great stuff in this booklet. Now, this is probably the most common slogan of all. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, and you'll hear this a lot, especially when you try to talk about evidence for the resurrection or other Christian evidences. You'll hear extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it's just supposed to be devastating as a slogan because guess what, Mr. Christian? You don't have any extraordinary evidence. Ha! So we win because you have an extraordinary claim, but you don't have any extraordinary evidence. You just have this mundane evidence or whatever. I don't know, whatever they want to say. If they want to say it smugly, I'm sorry. Not every atheist or agnostic is smug, but some people using these slogans, they are going to say them like that. So, okay, how do we respond to this? With questions. That's our key tactic. First question, you have to ask this. And, I should have said that the people who recommend questions, primarily Greg Kokel, an evangelical apologist, and Trent Horn in the Catholic world, they say the first question you can always ask if you're stumped in any conversation is, what do you mean by that? So what you have to ask this person is, what do you mean by extraordinary claims? And this is going to be very foundational. They might say, well, what do you mean it's an extraordinary claim? You're saying that Jesus rose from the dead or they did miracles. Well, just, I know, but just humor me for a second, buddy. What do you actually mean by extraordinary claims? And I really only think they can come up with, I list 2 answers in the book that I think that they're going to give you. And they're either going to say, well, an extraordinary claim is something that is extremely, extremely rare, or they're going to say an extraordinary claim is something like that involves the supernatural or miracles. And in either of those cases, we have a good response. Because, one, if extraordinary claims just mean super rare events, well, there are super rare events that happen all the time. Your friend could call you up and say he just won the Mega Million jackpot or he won a lottery. And that's an extremely rare event that your friend wins the lottery, but that wouldn't take, anything extraordinary to prove. He could show you the lottery ticket. He could say, look, here it is. He could tell you about it. And we just need good, regular old evidence to show that. Nothing out of the ordinary is needed to justify the fact that a rare event occurred, just regular, good, mundane evidence. But say they take the second route. Say they say, well, by extraordinary claim, I mean something supernatural or a miracle. Well, again, in this step, this takes the question back a step. It reveals that, it's really your worldview and the person's worldview that is coloring the debate. Because if they believe in naturalism, that there's no God and nothing like God, well, then obviously there's no miracles because there's no one to work a miracle. So if God exists, however, if we're a theist, if we're a classical theist, then again, of course, God can do a miracle. So you might want to ask the person, well, hey, but if God exists, couldn't an extraordinary claim be worked by God? And of course, if they're honest, they would say yes. So that's the first tactic. I would ask that question. This can get a little bit more involved, though. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna, I'm just gonna give one more question, Gary, and then I will say this chapter and the chapter on the problem of evil are two of the longer ones in the book. So if you want to get all those details, you can download it. But I'll just give another question you want to ask. What do you mean by extraordinary claims? And then you want to ask them, what do you mean by extraordinary evidence? How does that differ from just good evidence, for instance? What does that actually mean? Because it sounds cool. All right, it sounds devastating. Extraordinary evidence. You don't have that. You can't have that. What do you actually mean by extraordinary evidence? And again, I list a couple of possibilities that they might say. They might say, well, extraordinary evidence overcomes an exceedingly low intrinsic probability. It's got to be evidence that overcomes an extremely low intrinsic probability. But again, that question is tied up with worldview. Because if God exists, then he can work a miracle, and that doesn't necessarily have an exceedingly low intrinsic probability. But the second thing they might say, well, I mean extraordinary evidence, it's got to meet a very, very high bar of probability. You have to be like 99.99% certain for that to be extraordinary evidence. And to that, I would just say, well, hey, wait a minute. We don't accept that reasoning for a ton of things. Many historical, political, ethical, economic claims, they fail to reach that high bar. But are they irrational to believe? Is it irrational to belong to a political party or to take a position on a historical fact just because you don't have 99.99% evidence? It just seems like a very unreasonable position to take. So that's a start. I go into more detail in the chapter, but ask them two things. What do you mean by extraordinary claims? What do you mean by extraordinary evidence? And then prepare some of those common replies.
Yeah, very good. If I could throw in the sensei, throw in two of his own cents here. One thing I like to point out is that you're sitting underneath a roof, and that roof could collapse and kill you. So your life is at stake. Do you have absolute, extraordinary evidence that the roof won't collapse?
That's a very good question. If they're going to say the very high bar of probability, I guess they would have to say no.
Yeah, but they're staking their life on it, though. Yeah, that's beautifully put, because we can't live in that. That's pretty rarefied air when you get to evidence that, it's like 99.9. We would be crippled if we operated like that.
That's a good example to give, though, Gary. I'm going to steal that. Maybe that'll be in the next edition with the roof, because it's. Yeah, I just steal everything. Hey, as an apologist, as a teacher, in my high school classroom for math, you find people doing good stuff. You just ask them to borrow it, and usually they have no problem, and then you do it. But that's a great example because everyone can understand that. It's a good example to use. You're in a room, you have a roof, and if you're going to say 99.9%, I like that question.
Okay. Well, please, rip it off. That's the beautiful thing about apologetics, John, is that we're all a bunch of holy thieves stealing from each other. But it's done for a godly purpose. So I don't know if that is morally correct, but that's the way it is. Let me throw out another objection. You take the Bible literally. Ha ha ha.
Well, and I say that actually, it says, do you take the Bible literally? Ha, 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 because that's literally probably what they're going to do after they ask the question. Laugh. This question I got from Bishop Robert Barron. So how do you respond to that? Do you still take the Bible literally? And then they'll just laugh at you. And a great question to ask, and I'll just keep it quick, is just, well, hey, do you take the library literally? And they'll be like, wait, what? So what would you say to that? Well, do you take the library literally? And, what are they going to say? Well, of course, I don't know how to answer that. It's kind of a weird question. Parts of the library are taken literally, parts are not. And it depends. Am I in the nonfiction section? Am I in the novel section? Am I in the, technology section? Well, and that's exactly our point with the Bible. The Bible is not just a single book. It's a collection of as Gary Machuda would defend, 73 books, not just 66 books, and parts of other ones. But what I would say is that the library, just like the library, the Bible has sections that are absolutely written as history. Some sections in the Old Testament are more of an interpretive history, whereas in the New Testament and the Gospels, we find more of a ancient biography. There's a variety of genres. There's poetry. There's, the Psalms, of course. A lot of people think Genesis has many different genres within it. They say chapters 1 through 11 are more of an ancient prehistory, whereas, the later chapters after Abraham comes into play are more historical. So the bottom line is, the question is, it depends what section of the Bible we're talking about. And then let me just give one quick follow-up, and then we'll try to hit one more slogan. Skeptics will sometimes say, well, you said you can't take the whole thing literally, therefore, which parts are you going to take literally? It's just going to be the parts you don't like, and I win, and something like that. But I'm like, That's just stupid. I mean, come on. This is the whole point. This is why people devote their lives to studying the Scriptures and studying the Bible, even if they're unbelievers. Some people will go into this because that's the work of biblical criticism, biblical analysis. You go into the text, you try to figure out the genre. Thankfully, as Catholics, we have the tradition of the Church to help guide us, with some principles that we know we have to hold on to. But that's what biblical theologians do. They go to the text, they try to figure out the genre, the style, what's being asserted, and they work from there. So do we take the Bible literally? I asked that person, do you take the library literally?
Yeah, that's a great comeback question because the Bible is a virtual library. I mean, that's what it is. It's
exactly. And I got that from Bishop Barron. I'm sorry to cut in, but Bishop Barron, you got to listen to him, because he's great. He has great in-depth stuff. But then even on his YouTube videos, sometimes he just has great comebacks in the comments. Nowadays, he's so busy with doing so many different things. But in his earlier days, he would just comment in the YouTube section. He would have great comebacks like that.
Oh yeah, excellent, very good. Wow, I just can't believe that the entire hour just flew. This is a lot of fun. We'll have to have you back on the show. I know that you're a very busy person yourself, but this is so much fun. We need to go over some of your other material as well. Now, how can people get a hold of your stuff?
Sure. So, and thanks again for having me on, Gary. It was a ton of fun. I'm sighing because the hour is over. It's been a lot of fun. I go through all these slogans all day. But just go to classicaltheism.com, and you'll see it's right in the top left. You can just enter your email and hop on the email list to grab the book. And honestly, I understand people are inundated with information these days. If you want to just download the book, snag it, and then if I hope you don't, but if you have to unsubscribe because you're already on 15 mailing lists, I don't care about that. Nothing personal. I want you to have this information. I want you to be able to use it in conversation. I think what the slogans do, once you're confident in answering the slogans, you won't be afraid to initiate conversation, and you won't be afraid when people throw them out in conversation. You'll be confident. You can respond. You can have something to say. You won't just need to hide, and you won't just need to panic. And then hopefully you can spend more of your time studying the more advanced material. Once you get past these slogans, you have them under your belt, you can say, okay, well, how can I improve my proficiency at discussing the resurrection, discussing Jesus' divinity, and you build on it from there. But that's where they can go, classicaltheism.com, the book's in the top left, and hopefully they enjoy the podcast as well.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, John. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary. Right. I would love to be on again. It's always a great time. Thank you so much.
All right. John DeRosa, ladies and gentlemen, classicaltheism.com. Check out the website. Doing great work over there. Coming up next, we have the dynamic duo of Catholic Talk Radio, high-intensity Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. By the way, coming up tomorrow, Ken Hensley comes into the dojo. We're going to talk about laying a foundation for belief. And it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center and turn off the lights. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful, blessed day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, so I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.